Support for Audacious with Chion Wolf provided by a generous contribution from Suzanne Hopgood in memory of Frank Lord.
From Connecticut Public Radio in Hartford, this is Audacious. I'm Chion Wolf, and here is how I developed one of my biggest regrets. My stepfather, Guy Wolf, came into my life when I was 12. He was a prosecutor, and his experiences in the courtroom with people who had done terrible, terrible things were met at home with my more innocent worldview. When he would tell me about what went on in court that day, we usually agreed on the crime's heinousness, but totally disagreed on the sentencing. And since the disagreements weren't personal, they were kind of fun. Our back and forths sharpened my critical thinking and debate skills, and I'd like to think that I got through to him now and then, even if he didn't show it. But in 2016, we had a huge fight about politics, and things got personal. I stormed out of the house. He called me names, and every email or phone call after that just made everything so much worse. So I told him that in order to preserve whatever good memories of us remained untouched by all this, I was going to stop all contact. We were estranged for 5 years, until he was on his deathbed. And even then, even as I watched him die, neither of us spoke a word to each other. I regret that. I wish I'd had the courage to tell him that I loved him. And if I couldn't have done that, I at least wish I would have said, thanks for all the good things. And there were many good things. And that's how regrets go. They suck. But then they can also be formative. Now I know that if I'm ever in a similar situation, I'd like to think that I'll make a different choice, one that I can be proud of. So today, we ponder the utility of regret. Poet David Whyte joins us with a reading, and we catch up with two audacious guests from our most listened to episode of all time, featuring people who regret becoming parents. And audacious listeners share some of the things they wish had gone differently. But I promise, this is not going to be a whole episode of doom and gloom. There's beauty, growth, and lessons you can only get from regret. Daniel H. Pink knows all about it. He's the author of The Power of Regret, How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. And he studied regret across America and the rest of the world. Over 26,000 people from 134 countries responded to his World Regret Survey, which led him to identify 4 core regrets that most people have.
One of them is what I call a foundation regret. Foundation regret is a small decision that people make early in life, small decisions usually that people make early in life, or indecisions that people make early in life, no single one of which is devastating, but that accumulate to some bad outcomes. So the classic one, we've got lots of them, are I spent too much and saved too little, now I'm broke. Or I didn't eat right or exercise, and now I'm profoundly unhealthy. Or I didn't work hard enough in school, and as a consequence, my skills aren't as great, and my opportunities to make a living aren't as great as I thought as they could be. So that's one, foundation regrets. Another one, big category, are what I call boldness regrets. And this is a good example of why the domain is less important than the underlying psychological mechanism. Basically what it is, people describe being at a moment in their life where they have two options. They can play it safe or they can take the chance. Play it safe or take the chance. And overwhelmingly, when people don't take the chance, they regret it. Not all the time, just to be fair. There are people, so I tried this, start a business, and it went south on me, and I should never have done it. But overwhelmingly, people regret not taking the chance. And again, it doesn't matter whether it's asking somebody out on a date, although I have hundreds of those regrets about not asking somebody out on a date. I have hundreds of regrets about not traveling, hundreds of regrets about not speaking up. It's basically, I was at a juncture in my life and I chickened out, and now I regret it. And the third category are moral regrets. So these are people who, again, they're at a juncture. They could either do the right thing or do the wrong thing. And when they do the wrong thing, they regret it. And so we have lots and lots and lots of regrets about infidelity. I mean, I found it shocking how much infidelity regrets there were. The website, this part, people were using it in some ways as an online confessional, I think. A lot of regrets also around the world about bullying, which really surprised me. Not about being bullied, but about being the bully. And then the fourth one are connection regrets, which are regrets about relationships, typically not romantic relationships, just the full spectrum of relationships that were intact or should have been intact, and they come apart. And somebody wants to reach out, they don't. The drift widens, and sometimes it's too late. And so around the world, these 4 regrets kept coming up over and over and over and over and over. I mean, obviously, there were some in the 26,000 that didn't fall neatly into one of those 4 categories. But it's pretty remarkable how so many of them, the vast majority of them, slide into one of those categories.
And these are people who are self-selected to say, yes, I would fill this out.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, I would say this thing. And people who have sort of the internal wherewithal to look at their past actions and maybe be a little bit critical or be maybe more honest with themselves than they have. And so this slice of humanity that's responded to these surveys is a certain kind of person. And I can only imagine that they represent so many more. And in a way, you touched on people feeling deep regret about infidelity. And you also said that it was sort of a confessional, a feeling of being part of a confessional. And so did you feel in a way that like having this as an opportunity for people to participate in was therapeutic for them? Or is that just my projection?
I think so. So a couple of things here. You make a very good point about this World Regret Survey was not a random sample. It was self-selected. So I think there are limits to the conclusions one can draw from that. I tried to mitigate that by having this massive amount of stuff. I mean, 26,000 is pretty good. If it's 26 people self-selected, 26,000 mitigates some of that. But this is one reason I did the public opinion survey, where that was entirely a random sample. We had panels of people who had no idea what even this project was. They were just people who were on panels for public opinion surveys. I did that mostly to look at demographic differences in regrets. Our men have different regrets than women, et cetera, et cetera. There weren't that many, actually. It was sort of, that surprised me too. But one of the things that we saw there is that I asked the question, how often do you look back on your life and wish you had done things differently? Something like 87% of people say that, I'm somebody who does that occasionally, at least occasionally. And then some people doing it a lot. And only 1% of that sample said, I never, So you have these people who have this. You have people out there in the world or on social media with this performative, no regrets, everything happens for a reason, But that's complete BS. We know that from other realms of science, and we know this from this public opinion survey, where only 1% of people actually said, I never do that.
They could be neurodivergent in some way.
Well, it's an interesting point, because, I mean, what we know from neuroscience and other things is that there are people who truly don't have regrets. 5-year-olds don't have regrets.
What?
5-year-olds don't have regrets because regret requires incredible cognitive power. For regret, you have to travel in your head. You have to think about what you do with regret. All right. You're in the present. You get into a mental time machine. You go into the past. You undo what happened in the past. Then you hop back in your time machine to the present. But now the present is different because of what you did in the past. I mean, it's cognitively very complex. So kids don't develop this capacity until about age 7 or 8. I don't know about people who are neurodivergent. It's an interesting question. I actually don't know that. There are people with certain kinds of neurodegenerative diseases don't experience regret. Certain kinds of Parkinson's, certain kinds of Huntington's, because their brains can't do counterfactual thinking properly. And sociopaths don't have regret.
Or psychopaths, probably.
No, yeah. So certain kinds of pathology, whether it's a psychiatric pathology or whether it's a more neurodegenerative pathology. What this shows us is that generally the people who don't have regret are people whose brains haven't matured or whose brains are malfunctioning, which suggests that the ability to feel regret, the ability to look backward and feel bad about it and use that as a signal to change your behavior is adaptive. It can make us better. And we have a lot of evidence that regret not only makes us human, that almost everybody has regrets, but that if we treat our regrets properly, the regrets can make us better. They can actually improve our performance and our well-being going forward.
So you're saying to treat a regret properly is even a choice, how can people choose to treat their regrets differently?
Yeah, I do think it is a choice. I didn't phrase it that way, but I think that's an interesting way to put it. There's a little bit of triangulation here. So what we have in general is, well, we have a bigger problem here. Let me give it the top level problem here. The top level problem here is a distinctly American problem, which is that we're over indexed on positivity. We think that the path to a good life is to be positive all the time and never be negative, to always look forward and never look back. And there's a germ of truth in that. You should be positive. Positive emotions are great. Positive emotions make life worth living. But a life with only positive emotions is not a good life. It is not a life fully lived.
No contrast.
It's not a life where you learn and where you grow. And so the problem is that we haven't been taught well to deal with our negative emotions, particularly the negative emotion of regret, which is, we have evidence in social psychology, the most common negative emotion that people experience. And so on the one hand, we have people who ignore their regrets. They feel that regret starts coming in. They plug their ears. They say, no, be positive. Don't think about it. That's a bad idea.
Don't do that. You're saying don't compartmentalize.
Don't do that. So ignoring your regrets is a bad idea. But what's also a bad idea is wallowing in your regrets, stewing in your regrets, ruminating on your regrets, soaking in your regrets. That's a really bad idea too. What we want to do is think about our regrets, use them as information, as signal, as data. We have 60 years of evidence that it can help us become better problem solvers, clearer thinkers, better strategists, better negotiators, find more meaning in life.
I want to ask a weird question, like, if you could invent a technology that allowed people to selectively erase specific regrets from their memories, I'm betting you wouldn't invent it.
I'm going to say no, because one can't think about this from an evolutionary perspective. Here we have this emotion, regret. It makes us feel bad. Let's be clear about that. Regret makes us feel bad. We feel crappy when we experience regret. And yet this emotion is ubiquitous in the human experience. So what's going on here? Are we miswired? I don't think so. It's that it serves a purpose. And the purpose that it serves is to help us learn from the past and make better decisions in the future. Everybody wants to make better decisions in the future, do better, make progress and do better going forward. They just don't like the feel bad part. And the feel bad part is integral to the doing better part. And so if you said, okay, grief is a terrible emotion. It can be devastating for people. Do I want to eradicate the emotion of grief? No, I don't. We grieve because we love. Grief exists as an adaptive emotion that reminds us that we love. And so I wouldn't want to eradicate that. What I would want to do is give people ways to contend with their grief, to make, sense-making tools so they can take that grief and use some of that pain and enlist it to live better going forward.
So let's say we hang up this Zoom call. I go out into the world and I do something that I deeply regret.
Mm-hmm.
A big one.
Okay.
A one where I know I look back at the date and shudder.
Oof.
What should I keep in mind as I begin to process this terrible error?
It depends on what kind of regret it is. If it's an action regret, if you've hurt somebody, it's possible. One of the reasons that action regrets sometimes linger less long is that we can do something about them. We can make amends. We can repair the harm. We can do something if it's an action regret. For other kinds of things, I think one of the most important things to do is to have some degree of self-compassion. The research on self-compassion is one of the things in the course of researching this book that really blew me away. I didn't know anything about it. And essentially what it says is that it's sort of a form of triangulation. Self-esteem, totally oversold. Self-flagellation, also oversold. It doesn't work very, like self-criticism, endless lacerating self-criticism, it doesn't improve your performance. What seems to improve your performance is treating yourself with kindness rather than contempt, recognizing that you're a human being and what you're doing is part of the human condition. There's also a very strong argument for talking about or writing about your regrets as a form of sense-making. And then what's also important is looking at that regret and extracting a lesson from it to go forward. And in that sense, the regret ends up being something that you can enlist to live better in the future.
And to be open about it so that other people can learn from your mistakes. We're in a wonderful era where I think people are willing to bleed from the pulpit and talk about being in the messy middle of their lives instead of waiting until they're quote unquote healed or integrated in order to talk about it. And so if you're wired in a way that lets you be open about it, your mistake, your error, your regret, it'll likely help other people either avoid making the same mistakes or at least minimize some damage and or feel like they're not alone in having gone through it.
You're exactly right. And the other thing about that is that when you do that, when you bleed from the pulpit, as you're describing, is that it can be a service to other people. It's also a service to yourself on two dimensions. The first is that, negative emotions are inherently abstract. They're amorphous. They're blobby. And when we talk about them, when we write about them, we take this blob and make it more concrete, and that makes it less menacing. The other thing has to do with how people view you. We have a forecasting error where we say if we disclose our mistakes and our vulnerabilities, people will think less of us, when in fact, in many cases, not all, when we disclose our vulnerabilities and mistakes, people actually think more of us. They admire our candor. They empathize with us. So what you're suggesting, yes, it is a service to others, but it's also something that's good for you.
Well, I have no regrets in talking with you. Thank you so much, Daniel Pink, for talking with me.
Total pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You do it to yourself, you do. And that's why it really hurts. You do it to yourself, just you.
We invited Audacious listeners to tell us about some of their regrets, and they were varied.
2 words, tramp stamp.
I definitely regret getting a perm and having bangs in 6th grade. I feel like I'm still growing out that really bad idea. I also regret telling my mom it was her fault and she should never have let me do that.
I regret selling my Stradivarius trumpet when I was 22 years old. I needed to move out of my mom's house, and that was the asset I had.
A woman named Chelsea cleaned my house every other Wednesday for more than 20 years. On her last day, when she was retiring and moving back to Poland, I said goodbye and I wished her good luck, but I didn't take a moment to stand up and tell her how grateful I had been for her work all those years or how much she had meant to me. And now I can't find her, and it's too late.
I regret not joining the military. I feel like I let little me down.
When I was a teenager, I stole 2 Bachman Turner Overdrive 8-track tapes that were on someone's porch. It was a dare. I didn't have an 8-track player, and I didn't even like BTO. But I can't tell you how many times I think about how crappy it made me feel, even to this day. I'm 60 years old. It's petty, but it's a regret nonetheless. I can't hear anything come on the radio by BTO without thinking about this.
That was Brenda Kestenbaum. You also heard from Steph MacGillivary, Susan Tilley, AmyLaBossiere, Jennifer Crookes Carpenter, and Mary Ailes. When we get back, poet and philosopher David Whyte offers thoughts on how regret might serve us.
Almost always there's a thread of regret running through a human life, and it's there for a reason. It's knocking on our door.
And I'll be catching up with the 2 mothers from our show about regretting parenthood. How have their feelings evolved 4 years since we talked?
It's made me be a more intentional person. The regret helped me see a lot that I wouldn't have seen otherwise.
I'm Kyone Wolf. This is Audacious. Stay with me. This is Audacious. I'm Kyone Wolf. The word regret has a punchiness to it, a finitude, a feeling like you're being sentenced to something. Regret. David Whyte has spent a lot of time with this word and others in his books Consolations and Consolations 2, The Solace, Nourishment, and Underlying Meaning of Everyday Words. He first joined us in 2022 to share a reading and reflection for our episode about forgiveness. This time, he shares his short essay, Regret.
Regret is a short, evocative, and achingly beautiful word, an elegy to lost possibilities, even in its brief enunciation. It is also a rarity and almost never heard, except where the speaker insists that they have none, that they are brave and forward-looking, and could not possibly imagine their life in any other way than the way it is. To admit regret is to understand we are fallible, that there are powers in the world beyond us. To admit regret is to lose control not only of a difficult past, but of the very story we tell about our present. And yet, strangely, to admit sincere and abiding regret is one of our greatest but unspoken contemporary sins. The rarity of honest regret may be due to our contemporary emphasis on the youthful perspective. It may be that a true useful regret is not a possibility or a province of youth, that it takes a hard-won maturity to experience the depths of regret in ways that do not overwhelm and debilitate us, but put us into a proper, more generous relationship with the future. Except for brief senses of having missed a tide, having hurt another, having taken what is not ours, youth is not yet ready for the rich current of abiding regret that runs through and even emboldens a mature human life. Sincere regret may, in fact, be a faculty for paying attention to the future, for sensing a new tide where we missed a previous one, for experiencing timelessness with a grandchild where we neglected a boy of our own. To regret fully is to appreciate how high the stakes are in even the most average human life. Fully experienced, regret turns our eyes attentive and alert to a future possibly lived better than our past.
Thank you so much. It makes me feel like I want to do more stuff that I'm going to regret later.
Well, yes. I mean, there is a way in which a youth which has done nothing to regret is one that might be entirely wasted. Part of life is finding out, and finding out in a proper, courageous relationship with the unknown. And part of that courage is admitting that you don't know what's going on half of the time. And one of the thresholds of maturity in a human life is understanding that you don't know what's going on half of the time. But the great relief in that is that you don't have to know. Before you reach that threshold of maturity, you're under the impression that you're supposed to know everything. And so regret's a lovely way of undoing forms of false knowledge, and also of, as I say in the essay, of emboldening ourselves for a future life, of something where you deeply understand where you've hurt another, or you've hurt yourself, or you've missed a tide, puts you into a very deep and attentive relationship with both your immediate future and the far horizon that might be beckoning you on.
And on the other side of it, you don't necessarily need to be bathing yourself in regrets so that you can revel in what might be coming, as if you could front load this ability to face the future because you've just covered yourself in regrets and now you're armed.
Yes, you don't want to indulge in it, but almost always there's a thread of regret running through a human life, and it's there for a reason. It's knocking on our door, and it's asking you to face. Sometimes, the regret is where you weren't affectionate enough, you weren't present enough, you didn't love enough, you didn't give enough, you weren't generous enough. And so it's almost always an invitation to doing all of those things in your present life. Starting to be generous to a fault, starting to risk yourself by being affectionate, and working your way into the subject of one of my recent essays in Consolations 2, which is intimacy, which is the ability to live from the inside out. And sometimes we're afraid of actually joy and happiness that's living inside us. But and joy and happiness can also live in parallel to regret at the same time. We get confused, but you're actually supposed to feel them both. And often there's a conversation between the two, between your joy and happiness and your regret. That's actually crucial. That needs to be somehow lived out. So to be able to be intimate is to feel whatever you're feeling on the inside at the deepest level that you can, and put that into conversation with being as fully in the world as we can at the same time.
What do you think about regret being seen as a form of love? Love for what we've lost, for what might have been. And I think if we didn't care about how the relationship went wrong, or how you erred in a choice of words, or made any sort of error, if you didn't care, then you wouldn't necessarily regret it. So I wonder in what ways, if at all, you tie regret and love.
Yes, I mean, I think love is a deep form of attention. And attention, real attention, is real presence. And real presence always calls for some kind of conversational meeting with what you're paying attention to. Yeah. And that's deeply connected to the way we care. And one of the essays in the second Consolations, which is just out, Consolations 2, I have an essay called Care. The first line in the essay is, care doesn't care if you don't want to care. We're just made to care. And a lot of our unhappiness comes from our attempt to suppress the way we care. And it often comes out, one of the other essays in the first Consolation is on anger. And it's got one of the most radical lines in the book, actually, which is, anger is the deepest form of care. But it's care that has no body to carry it. So it spills over into violent language or violent actions. Yeah. But it's still located in the way we care. It's incoherent love, in a way. Helpless, vulnerable, incoherent care that has no pathway into the world.
You've said you love to cook.
Yes.
Any meals you've regretted making?
That's a really wonderful question. Yes, I've had lots of regrets in cooking, but that's part of you've got to be forgiving. Julia Child always made a thing of, even when she was putting an absolute disaster on the table, never to apologize for your own food, which is a very, very powerful thing to follow through on, actually.
Great thing for Julia Child, of all people, to say, too.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, David Whyte, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Nobody's fault but mine. Nobody's fault but mine. If I read my soul, nobody's fault but mine.
You're going to hear David again in an episode we're working on right now about courage. We'll have links to his books, Consolations and Consolations 2, at ctpublic.org/audacious. Now for more of our bold and brilliant Audacious listeners, they remind us that even our encounters with animals can leave us thinking, if only.
I picked up what I thought was a baby milk snake. It was not. It was a copperhead. It bit me on my finger faster than I could even imagine, with the tiniest little fang and all of the poison that it had. And I spent 2 days in the hospital. And I no longer pick up snakes, although when I see them, I really want to. I've got to stop touching things.
Forgetting to close the lid on the toilet seat 30 years ago when I had a free-roaming chinchilla named George.
Not taking more time off of work when our dog Odin was at the end of his life. I really wish that I had spent more time with him before we had to say goodbye.
I gave my cockatiel and Budgie to the wrong person. First, she changed their names. Lorena became Mike. John Wayne became Penny. Then they flew out of a window she'd left open. Adios, pajaritos.
I'll fly away, oh glory, I'll fly away.
That was Anne Levie. Thanks also to Jonathan Graham, Wendy Gravely, and Theresa Cannavo. After the break, hear reflections 4 years after I spoke with 2 guests about why they regret becoming a parent.
They're genuine feelings, and that doesn't impede on me being a great parent to my child.
I'm Kyone Wolf. This is Audacious. Stay tuned.
I'll fly away like a bird from prison bars that's flown. I'll fly away. I'll fly away, oh glory. I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by.
This is Audacious. I'm Kyone Wolf. I mentioned earlier that the most listened to episode in the 5-year history of Audacious was called I Regret Becoming a Parent. Want to know our second most listened to episode? The rerun of I Regret Becoming a Parent. So there is definitely a there, y'all. Now, back in 2021, when we first spoke with Tracy from Maryland, that's a pseudonym she's using to protect her kid from hearing this, she was the mother of a 9-year-old, feeling weighted down by a heavy regret about becoming a parent. So 4 years later, when she thinks about that regret now, how does it feel?
When you are a new parent, right, you have a newborn, they require more of you. So the regret is more prevalent. So as time goes on and that child gets older, they become more and more independent and the less that they require of you. So the regret tends to widen a bit and lessen over time. At some point, maybe my thought process will change. Maybe when he becomes an adult, maybe things will pivot and shift and maybe I'll have a different perspective. But as of today, the regret is still present. It's just something that I have to manage. And I think, it has its highs and lows, but it's definitely gotten a little better over time where it's not as heavy.
So it sounds like in some way you're saying that the degree to which he's reliant upon you and the degree to which you have to be involved in his life sort of dictates the degree to which you feel regret?
Correct. But it's not like I wake up every day full of regret, like every single day. And I think once upon a time, I felt it daily, but it's not as heavy.
Is there any part of you that sees regret as a useful utility, like something that has maybe shaped you into a more full version of yourself, or the challenge of the regret has somehow improved you? Or am I just stretching here?
No. I definitely think that it has shaped who I am. I think I've had a lot of opportunities to be retrospective into looking at myself and who I am as a person. It definitely gave me the foundation of what I like, what I don't like, what I want and what I don't want. It's made me be a more intentional person. The regret helped me see a lot that I wouldn't have seen otherwise.
When you have interacted with people who share your feelings of regret being a parent, how does that feel for you to connect with them?
Amazing. Because again, I feel like my thought process was wrong. Like something was wrong with how I felt, right? And even when I was initially early on having those feelings, I would go online and I would find chat boards and stuff like that where obviously with some person behind screen sharing their feelings. But I was like, there are people that feel how I feel and I'm not crazy, right? So I definitely appreciate when I do encounter someone that shares the same feelings and that they're genuine feelings. And that doesn't impede on me being a great parent to my child.
Well, I've asked everything I planned on asking, and I'm so grateful that you were willing to catch up with me. Is there anything I missed or anything you hoped we would talk about and I didn't ask you? Anything at all? Open floor.
For anyone that's listening that's currently struggling, there is light at the end of the tunnel. The regret does get better. Even though it doesn't go away completely, you're bigger than your regret.
Tracy, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity and the platform just to share my story.
In that original episode, Tracy was joined by a woman who went by Anna from Iowa. Well, she's not using a pseudonym anymore. Stormi Huhn reconnected with me to talk about her evolving relationship with regret over becoming a parent.
I think that I found a good balance in place of contentment now. So I'm not really regretting the life that I could have had without kids. I can find maybe not joy, but like I said, that contentment with my kids in the day to day. And then I think I've been very intentional in making the space for myself.
So is it safe to say that if you could undo this, if you could go back in time and not have kids, that's still what you would want, but you're saying that you have found ways to mitigate the regret?
Yes, I agree that if I could go back in time, it would still be my preference to have a life without kids. But I don't know if mitigate's quite the right word. It's almost as if like I can have my cake and eat it too. Whereas a few years ago, motherhood was so overwhelming, and it still is in a lot of ways, but I know that each phase will come and go, and there'll be a new, exciting thing that happens, or, a new challenge to take on, but I know that it'll just be temporary.
If you were to go back in time and talk to yourself when you and I last spoke, what would those words of wisdom be, or perspective?
I think knowing that I wasn't alone, just the fact of how much traction this prior episode got up with us. And then I had people reach out to me and saying, oh, I feel just like the way you are. And these people weren't monsters. They were normal people too. Yeah. And just feeling like I don't have to be ashamed of these feelings. They're normal.
Since this show that we're recording for is about regret in general, I've been thinking a lot about the utility of regret and how I certainly have things I regret having done, said, thought, but I also see how those regrets have helped form me going forward in the future decisions I'll make. And it's not quite the same as regretting having a child when it involves another human being existing. It's just a whole different ballgame. And so I don't mean to compare in that way, but I wonder, when you sit with the idea of regret, how do you think that it has formed you personally, dare I say spiritually, or in any other way that you sort of operate and grow in this world?
To me, regret shows up a lot like nostalgia, fixating on parts of my life that maybe I had in college that I don't have anymore, that type of freedom aspect. And that definitely plays into the kids. So, of course, it guides my future in certain ways, but I don't have to sacrifice all of me. There are things that are more realistic than others. But, if my husband's willing to stay home with the kids and I go on a big trip, I'm still having part of myself. And I think just finding that balance of how to still be me and how to be a mom will be ongoing as I proceed through life.
When you are out about your regret, what do you think are some misunderstandings people have about that regret?
They instantly think that I don't love my kids. And I'm pretty sure it's an assumption that I'm a bad person. But you know what? At the same time, I think that that's what I think that they feel. So it's kind of like that self-doubt piece.
Yeah, you're projecting because you worry that you're a bad person.
Yep.
For having these feelings.
Yep.
When I think about having a regret, I think about how it can really imprison you because you made a mistake or you weren't really listening to your gut or whatever, however the thing happened.
Yeah.
You are a prisoner of it and you are masochistic and you kick yourself for it and you wonder what other mistakes you're going to make and all this awful stuff. But what it sounds like you've come to is that you can regret doing something or doing some things and still be joyful and still see the bright side and see what good you can make of it. Have I got that right?
Yes, definitely. But I want to be clear. I'm not looking through life with rose-colored glasses. It is not persevere and fake happiness. For me, it's you can hold both. You can hold the hard parts and you can hold the parts that give you joy all at once.
Well, Stormi Huhn, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you. Take care.
Audacious is always lovingly produced by Jessica Severin DeMartinez, Meg Fitzgerald, Robin Doyon-Aiken, and Meg Dalton at Connecticut Public Radio in Hartford. By the way, the story I told you at the top of the show about my stepfather, Guy, and our estrangement, I did something with that regret. After he died, we made an episode of Audacious featuring the people who helped him and us through his final days and death. From the nurse case managers and hospice workers, to the funeral director, to the cantor at church. We even heard from my mom. The episode ends with a recording of Guy telling a story about a time when he was in the Merchant Marines when he thought he had died in an accident. It's a funnier story than it may sound coming from me, but I would love for you to hear his voice. We'll have a link to that episode and to the other ones we mentioned today at ctpublic.org/audacious. Stay in touch with me on the socials at Kyone Wolf, and you can always send an email to audacious@ctpublic.org. Before we go, you might be wondering why this episode is a little bit shorter than all the other ones. Well, that's because we left room in the radio version for fundraising. That's right, this is your opportunity to not regret supporting this show. Seriously, we love that our programming is supported mostly by listeners like you. So thank you for keeping Audacious in your podcast feed and supporting our future together. Visit ctpublic.org/donate and let us know in the comments field what this show means to you. We read every comment. Thanks.